Okay, well, I'm Don, as some of you may already know. I am with a independent game group called Endless Terminal Softworks. For those of you who aren't aware of us, I am the writer. And today we are going to go through something that I feel has been lost in, uh, sort of recent times, is tropes. There's a lot of negativity surrounding tropes. They're usually spoken of in derogatory terms, just like, oh, oh, here's a list of tropes, the same tropes over and over and over and over and over again. Yeah, but that's sort of the point. So tropes, why do we have them? Every story has within it a structure, has the same basic structure, and we'll get to that later. We've all seen it growing up in English class or whatever the equivalent of English class is, literature class in places where English isn't the primary language. Uh, and tropes help to enhance that structure and to guide it. The best way I can describe it is actually the diagram pretty much says it all. Venn diagram of superhero comic tropes. This is just one of the diagrams that I found online. And you can see, underwear on the outside, tricks against parents, capes. A lot of times you have vigilante characters who have had, this is just superheroes to begin with. A lot of, parents have died. And you see them in pretty much everything, but superheroes for the sake of this argument. You see it over and over and over again. And a lot of people like to chalk it up to just being unoriginal, which isn't the case. Uh, you need some sort of catalyst as to why someone would do the things that they do. For instance, to be a Batman, to be a Daredevil, um, or even just like mutants in general, to be a mutant, you don't just have powers and think like, oh, I guess I'll go save the world. There has to be something that really motivates you, and I'm sure that there are those characters out there. But there's nothing wrong with that motivation. But if you're just a normal person, what makes you give up your entire life to defeating crime or towards any sort of goal like that, something that radically changes you, that pretty much is going to ensure that your entire life is going to be one giant fight, and you're probably going to be at the end of it a broken down, miserable old person who has lost almost everyone that they care about, even after their parents. It's like, well, why do you do that? Because your parents died, you want revenge, or you're seeking justice, so on and so forth. So tropes are important. They they offer us additional structures, substructures within the main structure. That's why we have them, and every genre has them. It's sort of why you go to watch them. And we'll move on to there. This one's probably going to be a short one. I know I say that a lot, like, oh, it's only going to be half an hour, and then ends up being an hour. This one probably is going to be about half an hour. Okay, why do tropes work? Maybe a strange collection of pictures, but I'll explain it. One of my favorite uh, foods is pizza. One of my favorite bands is Soundgarden. As a matter of fact, if you put a gun to I don't really have a favorite band, but if you put a gun to my head and said, what's your favorite band of all time, I'd probably have to say Soundgarden. Now, when I go out, I like Marco's Pizza. Every Friday I get pizza. It's a family tradition. And this applies to any food place, really. Um, I go there and the pizza tastes the same over and over and over and over and over again. And I plan on that. I don't want it to taste different. Maybe I want it to taste better, but in general, I don't want to really kind of take that chance and have it be ruined. Again, there's a burger place I go to down the street. They have amazing burgers. It tastes the exact same all the time. Soundgarden has a variety of songs, Black Hole Sun, Pretty Noose, Rhinosaur, things like that. All these songs, I could hear them no matter what, and I will always enjoy them. But it's the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, I re-listened to all the Soundgarden stuff maybe a dozen times a year. And I do that with most of my bands, and most people do that all the time. Most people have a favorite song they've heard hundreds of times, and it never gets old. The reason being is that you enjoy it and you want it to stay the same. You don't want it to be radically different every time, and it also goes on, songs, for instance, have, depending on the genre, have a set structure. When I listen to a rock song, I sort of expect, you know, a verse, chorus, guitar solo or instrument solo, then chorus, and the song ends out. Not necessarily that same structure, but you kind of get the idea. There's a certain structure to songs. And again, it depends on the genre. Uh, and while I don't like bands that sound the same, you can immediately identify what a rock band is versus rap versus country versus techno, so on and so forth. And it's often a common criticism against the things like, oh, all that sounds the same, all that music sounds the same. It's like, well, yeah, that's kind of the point. That's why I like the genre. It's like, oh, it's like somebody saying, oh, all pizza is bread and sauce and cheese. Like, yeah, that's why I like it. All shakes are just, like all ice cream is just, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, I know what ice cream is. That's why I like it. That's why I enjoy it. And that's why tropes work, is that we like the same things over and over and over again. It's not that, I mean, if something being different is nice, but the reason you go back to them over and over again is that you like that particular structure, so you want it to remain the same. Little deviations in between. You don't want everything to be a carbon copy of everything that came beforehand, but you want it to remain more or less the same. That's why you enjoy it. If you watch like a horror film, people generally don't watch horror films for the deep plots behind them. They watch them to see gore and people getting killed, to be scared. And you know how a horror movie generally is going to turn out. You have 8 people, 7 of them are going to die by the end, maybe 6, and someone at the end is going to defeat the monster and get away. And then maybe there's going to be a jump scare at the end where the monster isn't really dead and they go after person and it cuts to black, whatever. Every horror film is like that. Now, not necessarily saying that you have to like the structure. For instance, I hate horror movies for that particular reason. Well, amongst others, but that's primarily one of the things, is that I know that's how it's going to turn out every single time. So that's why I don't like it. But for the same reason you don't like it, someone may like it for that reason. It's familiar. You know what you're going to get every time you watch something. And that's why structures like tropes, and that's what tropes are, their substructures are important. Now, everybody, I'm sure, has seen this. It's the arc of a story. It's the diagram of a story. You have the plot, exposition, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. It's right there for you, and probably everybody knows it. Tropes enhance this. Tropes help along with this. For instance, the conflict could be, we'll go with fantasy. Conflict could be a great evil has corrupted the land, and the main character lives in a small village, and it's destroyed. And then they take up arms to fight this great evil. Then they find out that as they're fighting it, they get into a fight with it, lose it, and they realize we need some ancient power or some ancient artifact. And they go get that ancient artifact, and then they use it to defeat the evil, and all is right, so on and so forth. That's a common story trope you'll see in video games, for fantasy books, TV shows, whatever. Same thing. You watch a superhero. You watch like a superhero origin story. It's the superhero is fine, just living their life. Something bad happens to them, it changes their perspective on things. They gain powers. They get captured, whatever, and they realize they can't let this go, so they use the newfound power or abilities to fight back, and they're doing really well. Then something happens that sets them back. They suffer a defeat, or they've been, stomping people, walking over people left and right, handing them their asses on a silver platter, and then they find something that they can't easily defeat, have to find the power or the skill or the will to fight them. They fight them, they beat them, so on and so forth, to move on to the next movie. Almost all superhero movies are like this. but we keep watching them over and over and over again. You know, we watched Thor, we watched Captain America, we watched Iron Man. It's the same story over and over and over again. Well, why? Because we like that. We enjoy the simplicity, we enjoy the structure, and everything needs a structure. What most people, what most people's criticism of tropes are not criticisms of tropes and the idea of tropes themselves. It's the specific tropes that they don't like. For instance, I watch anime not I sort of in between a casual and like a step above a casual anime fan. I watch an anime maybe every once 2 or 3 years. One of the things I don't like about anime, particularly action anime, is that they'll explain everything that happens. It's like, oh, my ability didn't work because this person can control this power, which then negates this power, and they really hit you in the face with it. It's not subtle at all. I don't enjoy that about anime, and I'm sure there are other things like, the guy trips and falls on and he grabs the girl's breast. It's just like, okay, come on, man. How many times am I going to see it? I just sort of ignore most of that. Maybe some people like that kind of trope, so on and so forth. Like the harem, if you watch a harem anime, the main character is dense and doesn't realize that all the girls like him, and it's just like maybe you enjoy that, maybe you don't, so on and so forth. I really don't mind it too much. I think it's kind of realistic in a way because maybe not exactly the way that the girls go about showing that affection, but if you ever have a chance, go on YouTube and look up Reddit compilations of like girls, when did guys not take your hints? And there's some really funny ones. My favorite one is a girl was saying that she saw a guy wearing a suit and she wanted to sleep with him. She said, it would look better. Like you look good in that suit, but it would look better on the floor. And the guy said, yeah, but that'll wrinkle the suit. The subtext went completely over his head, and so it's sort of realistic, sort of not. But regardless, that's what tropes are. They enhance the structure of the main. Their substructures enhance the main structure of how a story um, is formed. And they can also uh, help move the plot along. Like again, I stated the having to find the item or the power to defeat the evil, so on and so forth. I mean, it's pretty much every Legend of Zelda game. That's another good example. You played Mario, Princess Peach gets kidnapped, you have to go find her, fight Bowser, so on and so forth. That's some of the best. Same thing with Legend of Zelda. You get a bunch of items, you fight Ganondorf, rescue Zelda, or help out Zelda, regardless, over and over and over again. Same thing with game remakes. We buy the same game remade on a different console or the ported to PC over and over and over again. Why? Because we like the core of that game, and we just want to see a slightly different spin on it. So we do like simplicity. We do like familiarity. That's why tropes are so successful. And again, if you ever read books like Hero with a Thousand Faces or something like that, I believe that's the name of the book, where it just basically details that every single story from ancient mythology, or like the oldest stories we have, like the Epics of Gilgamesh to like John Wick, are pretty much the same. Um, book's older than the book was written long before John Wick, but you get my point. Uh, all structures remain the same. All tropes are the same. They've been present since the beginning of time. So sort of railing against them is sort of useless. It's done by people that I guess want to appear cool or trendy, in my opinion. They don't really understand story structure. They think just because something is different, it automatically means it's good, and that's absolutely not the case. The bubonic plague was a different kind of sickness. Didn't mean it was great. It's kind of a bad example. No one enjoys sickness. Um, it's a better example. I'm trying to think of a good one. Well, I guess I probably use World War One. Before World War One, everybody was excited about it. I know it seems strange to think in hindsight, but people were really excited about World War One. Like, yeah, we're gonna go, we're gonna get ourselves some glory. It's gonna be great. It's a new war, yeah, new war. It was not great in any way, shape, or form, and they learned that very, very quickly. Um, Oh, here's a good example. Justin Bieber was a new artist. Didn't make him good. Uh, that's still not a very good example. Oh, dubstep was a new kind of music. Didn't make it good. That's a good example. Sorry for all those like dubstep, but I can't stand it. Subverting tropes. Uh, Subverting tropes can be done. As I stated before in my previous videos, you can break any rule in writing, but you have to understand the rule in order to break it. You have to understand why it's there to begin with. It's like taking apart something. You have to understand how it's put together before you can take it apart successfully, or rebuild it or redesign it. You have to understand what its function or purpose is. Because if you don't have a function, you don't understand what the function of a particular object or machine is, and you try to build something to solve the same problem that the original machine solves, you're not going to solve anything. Um, a good example of subverting tropes, and this also goes for story structures. If anybody's ever familiar with the yeah, the if anybody's ever familiar with the movie Memento, it's actually a very good movie. It's one of Christopher Nolan's movies. I believe it's Christopher Nolan. It was either written or directed by him. I think it was written by him. But Guy Pearce plays someone with anterograde amnesia. Most people are familiar with retrograde amnesia, where you can't remember anything prior to a traumatic event. Anterograde is where you cannot form memories or retain memories after the traumatic event. So it's a guy that every day he wakes up, he forgets what he did the day previously. And the way that movie is shot is it's shot all out of sequence. It's not shot in chronological order. So you get bits and pieces from different parts of the story, and at the end it's all brought together, and it works. It's really, really good because the structure of how the narrative structure is understood by Christopher Nolan very, very well. So he can essentially break the rules and bring it all together. These also work for twist endings and things like that, like what you would explain. M. Night Shyamalan, he had some rough patches there, but at the beginning of his career, he did twist endings very, very well. You know, the I See Dead People, and I know I'm spoiling these movies, but again, they're over a decade old. Um, Another good example of, I won't spoil this one because it's relatively new, but Glass is another one of his movies. If you've ever seen Glass, I suggest you watch it. It's actually really good. Sort of subverts the superhero tropes very well. Unbreakable did that also very, very well, which is one of his earlier movies. I highly suggest you watch that. It's much better in hindsight now that I watch it that I'm older than I did when I in the theaters. But Glass subverts your expectations very, very well because it understood what the expectations were and why they existed. It plays off of an already established structure, and the structure is very, very well understood. And that's how you can subvert tropes, and that goes for any rules in writing whatsoever. Uh, Oftentimes, this is done poorly. I'm not going to go over all of the examples that I've talked about. I'll talk about it again just because it's a very common one. I'll talk about the Game of Thrones season 8, specifically episode 3. I'll talk about it because one, I want to spoil it for you because I really suggest you never ever watch that episode. I wouldn't do that to you guys. That's cruel and unusual punishment. It's really fucking bad. But it's also an excellent example of how not to do things wrong because it's so poorly done. And plus, Game of Thrones is also really, really widely seen. It really wouldn't work if I use some obscure example. But in Game of Thrones spends up to this point 8 seasons setting up a conflict between Jon Snow and the Night King, and in season 8, episode 3, the person that kills the Night King, the final confrontation with the Night King, isn't Jon, it's Arya. And it's like, we subverted your expectations. We subverted the tropes of the main character fighting the bad guy. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier in the previous slide. If you watch like an action movie or like a martial arts movie, there's a bunch of fights at the end. It always ends with the good guy and the bad guy getting in one epic fist fight, or one epic martial arts fight at the end. You know what's going to happen. You want it to happen. You look forward to it. And, afterwards, Dan and Dave said, it just didn't feel right. It just, blah, blah, blah. They came up with a bunch of different excuses. They didn't understand the source material that well. A lot of people are like, oh, Dan and Dave they're such great writers, such great writers. In reality, they had Dave R. R. Martin's or George R. R. Martin's source material to go off of, and then once they ran out of that, the show's writing took a noticeable dip in quality, and they just didn't understand why that was the way it was. They didn't understand the trope. They didn't understand how fantasy worked. They didn't understand that everything leading up to that point in Jon Snow's story was leading up to a confrontation with the Night King, and he pretty much just did nothing. And even in the next episode, everyone's all like, "Oh, Jon saved this. Jon saved this." It's just like you really didn't understand. You didn't even understand your own decision. You didn't. Yeah, it's really bad. It's really bad. It's a poor way to subvert a trope because they're just like, oh well. They even said, oh well, everyone was expecting Jon Snow to have this epic confrontation with the Night King, yada yada yada. And a lot of writers do that now to try to seem like cool and edgy and seem like they're a lot better than they are. Which most writers, at least for television and things like that, are pretty bad. They're pretty awful. But they try to subvert tropes and things like that, and they don't understand them. They just do it for the shock value. And most people, I hate to say it, most people, okay, no, a small subset of people fall for it. So subverting tropes, in summation, you have to understand why the trope is there to begin with, why it exists in order to subvert it. And also just the inner mechanics of how the trope works within the story or within the genre. When are tropes required? This is a thing for Wolf Among Us. If you've never played the game, I highly suggest you do. It's really, really good. But for those of you who don't know, Wolf Among Us is based off of the graphic novels of Fables, written by I think Bill Willingham, I believe his last name is Willingham, and it reimagines the Fables. Snow White, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Beauty and the Beast, so on and so forth, in a modern or like an 80s noir setting. And The Wolf Among Us follows Bigby Wolf, who's the big bad wolf. Now, when you have a character like the big bad wolf, and it also goes for like other characters like Frankenstein, any main literary character that you sort of reinvent or reimagine and bring it into another sort of genre, maybe, again, Fable. When you think noir, you really don't think like Puss in Boots. It's not the first thing that comes to your mind. So when you reimagine it in another way, particularly an already established piece of literature, you have to maintain some bits of the original source material in your reimagining. For instance, wolves generally tend to, when we imagine wolves, we imagine them to be hunters. In Fabletown, which is where all the fables live within New York, the big bad wolf is the detective. He's the hunter. Certain things, when you think of werewolves, you think of certain tropes. Weak to silver, full moon. Even, sometimes it's not just a full moon. Sometimes you can do it at will. Sometimes silver doesn't either kills them outright or merely weakens them, things like that. So when you do something like werewolves or vampires or something like that, you have to have certain tropes present. And if you're not going to have them present, you have to have some sort of workaround, some sort of workaround or explanation as to why they don't exist. But you generally have to have a number of those tropes already in there. If you have a vampire that's not affected by silver or garlic, or doesn't get killed by stake to the heart, or isn't affected by sunlight. It doesn't drink blood and stuff like that. You really don't have a vampire. And the same thing goes for like werewolves, or if you don't have someone that turns into a wolf or has wolf-like abilities or isn't affected by moonlight or silver, so on and so forth, you don't have a werewolf. If you have a Frankenstein story where somebody isn't brought back to life from various parts of dead people or anything like that, you don't have a Frankenstein. You have something completely different. So tropes in that particular case are required, and it also goes for different genres. Again, if you think about like an action genre like Rambo or John Wick or something like that, when you think of, or like James Bond, for instance, or any sort of spy thriller, when you make a James Bond movie, suave, debonair, charming, expensive cars, expensive suits, beautiful women, crazy gadgets, things like that. If you have none of those things, or almost none of those things, like if you just have a special agent or like a spy who is just really well dressed, and you slap James Bond on it, it's not going to work. No one's going to buy that. When people think of James Bond, they have an idea in their head of what James Bond is. And in order to make a James Bond film, it has to have some of those qualities, most of those qualities, if not all. And, one of the reasons I think that maybe the most recent James Bond films haven't done so well is that it's a more modern version of James Bond, one that isn't quite so devil may care, and I think it doesn't really resonate with audiences as much because it's not the same old James Bond they knew. And again, you may say, well, the franchise has been going on for a long time, so on and so forth. It's like, yeah, again, going back to the original point, that's why we watch James Bond films. We want to see a suave, charming, debonair spy with crazy gadgets and death-defying stunts and beautiful women hanging off his arms, so on and so forth. That's why we watch a James Bond film. So tropes are required many times because they help define and to fill out genres. That's also one of the biggest what's the word? It's one of the best functions of a trope is to enhance a story. And it's often thought that tropes don't do that. They demean a story, that they're not required. And it's like, you just really just don't understand. A lot of the writers think that they just don't understand writing. So tropes are absolutely 100% required. And they're a lot of fun. They're not a bad thing. They're not something you should hide from or shy away from. But if you do, again, understand why they are the way they are, why they exist, and how they function within the story. And that's pretty much it. There's nothing more to it. Tropes are fairly, I'll go back just to something that you can see. Tropes are, again, I don't know why, but fairly misunderstood in this day and age. They're veified, or not necessarily veified, but they're looked down upon. They're sort of eschewed and often leads to bad writing. It's just not very compelling writing. So again, don't be afraid of tropes. Embrace them. Use them a lot. Understand where they belong and why they belong. Have fun with them. It's also a great starting point if you want to get into writing. Stick pretty close to the tropes, and you'll have a fairly solid story. And what I always say is like, you write something, read it, come back to about a month later, and then see how you feel about it. And the more and more you use the tropes, the more and more you understand them, the better, the more experienced you are with using them or not using them if you so choose. So that's about it for this installment of Work Night. I hope you enjoyed it. One day I'll stop rambling. No, probably not. Probably not. That's my trope. That's why I think you secretly come here to hear me ramble. Maybe. Probably not. But that's it. Again, we're Endless Terminal Softworks. My name is Don. I'm the head writer. Hope you enjoyed this, and if you didn't, I want to apologize for it. I'm kidding.